Good evening. This is the Challenge of Faith series with me, Adrian Roberts, and I'm talking to you on the 29th of January 2017, the Sunday before the feast of the presentation of Christ in the temple. And my reading is going to be taken from Luke chapter 2, which tells the story of this presentation. And I'm going to start with a quote from the central passage where Simeon prophesies the Messiahship of Jesus, and I'm going to recite it in its traditional prayer book version. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared in the sight of all people, to be a light to lighten the Gentiles, and to be the glory of thy people Israel. Now, I have never been present at the inauguration of a President of the United States, and I've never witnessed the preaching, and it's highly unlikely that I myself will ever be asked to preach at such an inauguration. And I can tell you that I'm actually quite pleased about that, because it must be an extremely difficult thing to do. But I do have a couple of issues with the way in which the most recent inauguration of Donald Trump as the President of the United States was conducted. And the preacher preached on the prophet Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah built a great wall round Jerusalem to keep out the enemies of the Jews, as the returning exiles wanted somewhere safe to live. And he was opposed in this venture by Sanballat and Tobiah, locals who certainly didn't want a wall being built where there had been none before. And so, said this preacher, there is biblical warrant for the building of a wall in order to keep aliens out. Now, I do have quite a problem with this. And oddly enough, it's nothing to do with any problems I might or might not have with the policies of Donald Trump. I'm not going to reveal deliberately whether or not I would support him as a president. That's not the issue. It is far more to do with talking in messianic terms of somebody who is a secular head of state and is presenting themselves and is being acclaimed by some Christians as somebody who will bring a certain sort of secular salvation to the people who support him. And the problem with this is twofold. First of all, any sort of secular Messiah offering salvation is bound to disappoint people. An ordinary human being is going to be set round with all sorts of problems and difficulties in the pursuing of the agenda to bring about this salvation. It cannot possibly succeed in the way that it's been promised. And so the people to whom it has been promised are bound to be resentful and disappointed and to look for their salvation elsewhere. And the second thing, which I suppose is a connected point, is this. There is something essentially idolatrous in a human being saying that they will be the answer to everyone's problems, that they will offer a salvation, that they will be, as it were, a Messiah. For me as a Christian, the one true Messiah is, of course, Jesus. And the light that Jesus offers, the salvation Jesus offers, is a genuine one. And when we look at Simeon's prophecy, which is effectively prophesying that Jesus will be a Messiah for Israel, and not only for Israel, but for the world, we see another difference between secular messiahs, the false messiahs, the politicians who offer secular salvation, and the salvation offered by Jesus. And the difference is this. Jesus does not offer any easy solutions, any solutions to our day-to-day problems, any quick fixes. In fact, at first sight, what he's offering is something rather gloomy, something rather frightening, something rather off-putting. Simeon says to the Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother, who is regarded in the Catholic tradition as, in a sense, Jesus' first disciple, he says to her, when Jesus comes, a sword will pierce your own heart too. Now, this is hardly a comforting message. And it seems to mean two things, neither of which are remotely comforting. First of all, the sword piercing the heart exposes the innermost thoughts of a human. This is what Simeon might be quoting, something from the Old Testament. And it exposes the inner thoughts of the human heart to God's pitiless, at first sight, gaze, because God will not accept any compromise. God will not accept any falsehood, any evasion, any concealment. And so, when the Messiah Jesus comes, we stand before him without any pretense, without any covering, without any concealment. But the second way in which the coming of Jesus will cause the piercing of the Virgin Mary's heart is as it has been understood in the Christian tradition, and that is that the first effect of bearing the Messiah for Mary, in a sense her first disciple, was one of terrible suffering as she saw her beloved son tortured to death. So the two things at first sight that the Messiahship of Jesus promises is one, an uncompromising honesty about ourselves, and another, enormous difficulties if we are people who want to be beneficiaries of the salvation that is offered. But fortunately it goes much deeper than that, for ultimately the salvation Jesus offers is a good one. It is one that speaks to the very deepest of all human hopes. It is one that is based on love. It is a love that God is pouring out on us. It is a heavenly destiny that God has organised and destined us for. But it comes with a catch. It comes with a challenge to live in a certain way. As we have been loved, so we must love in our return. And not only love our friends, the command to love our neighbours as ourselves is nothing so bland as that. It is a command to love our enemies, to love those whom we most have reason to detest and to distrust and to fear. It is a command to love those whom we might feel we have most reason to despise and regard as of no account. And if we can love like that, we can indeed be beneficiaries of the loving salvation that Jesus is offering, via a path of total and pitiless honesty, and via a path of what may be very difficult suffering, things very hard to bear. And does this mean that Jesus' salvation is just one for the individual human being, a salvation offered to the depths of the human heart? Does this mean that Christians and other religionists should keep out of politics? Well, I don't think it does. I think we should be very careful about allying ourselves to a particular party wholesale. I think we should be very careful not to preach sermons suggesting that Nehemiah was directly supporting Donald Trump's plan to build a wall between the United States and Mexico. But Christianity, in a sense, is very political indeed. As Christians, I feel we should offer our wholehearted support to any government which attempts to keep the peace, which attempts to maintain reconciliation and righteous relationships between people and communities, in commerce and in all other aspects of human life. And insofar as a government also attempts to build reconciliation, to nurture, cherish and care for those who are despised and marginalised, that government should have our wholehearted support. But insofar as a government teaches hatred, insofar as a government attempts to build barriers between humans, insofar as a government, God forbid, might try to bring in an agenda of racial purity as part of the offering of a secular messiahship. And look what happened in the 1930s, that other time that a great secular messiah was proclaimed by his people. Then I believe that as Christians we should oppose and resist such a government with every root and fibre of our being, for such a government is not of God. It is not a government that keeps the peace. It is not a government that maintains justice. It is not a government of the Messiah. It is a government very much of its opposite. We may have difficult times ahead. The times may be very much better than we could have feared, but they may be worse than we are hoping for. But in that, let us try to put our trust in the true heavenly Messiah, Jesus Christ.